All right, students, welcome and welcome everybody else who is either watching or listening. We have a return guest. Michael Crawford is returning to talk to us today. He is the author of the Progress City Primer, a co-host of the Progress City Radio Hour, and he is very, very knowledgeable on the history of the company, the history of the parks. And if you missed the interview or the visit we did with Michael the first time, go back and watch that or listen to it and read the Progress City Primer. It's one of my favorite books for tidbits about the company and everything. I still almost on a regular basis, I still think of Bicentennial Ben. That's one of my favorite things from that book. So what we're going to talk about today is, with the Winter Olympic Games coming up, I thought it would be fun to discuss Disney's, as a company, their involvement with sports. And they've had involvement with the Olympics, but they've also had involvement with sport outside of the Olympic Games. I think most people know about the NBA season in 2020 finishing at Wide World of Sports, but outside of that, they have had a lot of involvement with the sport industry, and has both helped the sport industry and has used sport to help grow the company as well. So Michael is the perfect person to talk to about that, because he also discusses Disney's involvement with the 1960 Olympic Games and the Winter Games in his book. So without further ado, I've spoken long enough. Welcome, Michael. And for people who haven't watched or listened to the previous visit, could you give us the 2.5 minute kind of intro as to your fandom and how you got to where you are now?
Yeah, sure. Thanks. Thanks for having me back. I started off, I was a fan from an early age. We went when I was 5 to Walt Disney World, and that kind of hooked me pretty hard. And grew up during the glory days of the Disney Channel when all that old stuff was on TV regularly every day, and just kind of grew up immersed in this stuff. And eventually I started blogging about it at Progress City USA, and that kind of caught the eye of people. I wound up doing some work for D23 and for the archives, helping program some events for D23. And then one thing led to another, and I've done some contract work for Walt Disney Imagineering and also now Disney Event Group down in Florida. So yeah, it just kind of a hobby that became a career accidentally.
Well, and it's an awesome hobby slash career that you have, giving us all the information that you collect about the company. And I did want to ask one thing real quick, since you mentioned it in your intro. Since the last time you and I spoke, the Inside the Disney Archives has been released on Disney Plus, and I just wanted to get your kind of quick reaction to that show.
I loved it. I hope everybody checks it out. It was a lot of fun. I lived in LA from 2011 to 2015 and spent a lot of time over the archives doing research or just hanging out. And it was so fun to see all those folks on TV. But also, they've done some amazing projects since I moved to Florida, like the restoration of Walt's office to its original, or to its state when he passed away. And they're just always doing cool stuff. So it was really great to see them get that attention and to bring out some really neat artifacts. So I hope everybody checks it out.
Yeah, it's a really, really fun one to watch, and one that we discuss as a class later in the semester. So to get into what our main areas of our main topics are, first we'll start with the 1960 Winter Olympic Games. And you write about this in your book. We talked about it last time. We had a visit. But basically, um, the Disney Company was called on to kind of oversee the pageantry and the ceremony, the medal ceremonies and everything at the Olympic Games. And they became heavily involved in the Olympic Games, like well beyond kind of what their first mission was with the games. It was almost like at the bottom of the job application and other duties as applied or as requested. Can you tell us about what the Walt Disney Company did at the 1960 Winter Games and kind of what they started with and what they ended up overseeing at those games? Because they had a very large role.
Yeah, it's funny you're having me on to talk about this because just recently it was announced, or it became public, that a documentary that I helped out with about this, called The Magic in the Mountains,
Okay.
is going to be released soon. It's already online in a couple of places where you can find it. And it talks about the creation of the Squaw Valley Resort and then Disney's involvement in the Olympics. So this is good synergy for me, so I appreciate it. But Disney, well, Squaw Valley had gotten the Olympics for 1960. Nobody thought they were going to get it. It was kind of a publicity stunt. There really was nothing there. There was a lodge that had like burned down and been rebuilt, and there were a few ski lifts, but there was no infrastructure. I mean, there were barely roads going there. There was not enough parking. There was no housing. They didn't have government or police or anything. So they had no infrastructure needed to put on an Olympic, even though, I mean, the Olympics were smaller back then than they are now, but still, you needed people and things to do it and facilities. So they brought in a lot of people, experts on different things, but for pageantry, they called on Walt Disney, and they approached him in 1958. There was a guy named Prentice Hale who was the head of the organizing committee, and he went to Walt and went to the studio and met with him and asked him if he'd do this. Walt said yeah. Walt would later say, I had no idea what I was getting into, because this kind of grew into a whole thing. And what it wound up being was not only doing pageantry, the ceremonies, medal ceremonies, opening, closing ceremonies, decor, entertainment, all these things, but even consulting on things like parking and ticketing and just logistical things, which they had a lot of experience from at Disneyland, and they were able to lend that experience. But also, it was expressly stated when they started, we want this to be the biggest sort of showpiece Winter Olympics ever. And that was their goal. That's what they went for.
And one thing that my students in the international sport class that I teach, they will be aware that the 1960 Summer Games were very influential in that they were the first televised games. They had a number of firsts and kind of highlights of those games. But the 1960 Winter Games, the impact that those had on future games is pretty immense. And in your book, you talk about some of the ways that the 1960 games, those Winter Games, have influenced future games and the pageantry around future games. Can you discuss a little bit of that?
Yeah, there was a lot of technological, a lot of pageantry. I mean, you mentioned TV. This was the first one. They sold the TV rights to CBS for $50,000, and so because it was the first to be televised, it was also the first to have instant replay. That was an innovation. It was the first Winter Olympics to have an Olympic Village, because there weren't hotels or anything. There weren't houses for people to stay at, so they needed an Olympic Village. And Disney contributed a lot to that entertainment-wise. Every night they would have entertainment there that was provided by Disney or facilitated by Disney. But it was also, the first Olympics. Other Olympics had opening ceremonies, but then there's that sort of Disney opening ceremony with a release of doves and fireworks and that kind of things. Disney brought that aspect in. They also, in the past, uh, each event did not necessarily have a big public medal ceremony. But some did, some didn't. This was the first one where each one had a big ta-da medal ceremony. Things like the design of the torch. John Hinch redesigned the Olympic torch for this event, and his design, they change over the years, but each one has had that same kind of form factor because he designed it to be easy to carry and things like that. So a lot of things like that, things that we think are, natural, like even as simple as like daytime fireworks. They build this as, well, this is the first widespread use of daytime fireworks. So a lot of stuff like that.
Yeah. And I do want to say something that you brought up, correct something that I had previously said, that I said the 1960s Summer Games were the first that were televised. They were televised on a tape delay basis. So basically they had they were shown like in 30-minute segments, I think.
Oh, interesting.
You are right about this being kind of the first televised, and then once they got to the Summer Games, they were doing a few different things. But one of, like, something I think is really interesting that a lot of people now who watch the games wouldn't realize was actually a need is the athlete entertainment. And I don't think a lot of people realize that as part of the Olympics, they have to have athlete entertainment. And actually, if you go back to ancient Olympics, there was entertainment and riding and horn playing and like guitar playing and everything, harp playing they were actually part of the Olympic Games. They had competitions for those. But so could you talk a little bit about the entertainment that the athletes experience that maybe wasn't shown to the public, whether they were attending or on television?
Yeah, this was really cool. It was a really exciting thing when you hear the people who were in those Olympics talk about. Was really exciting for them because, Walt obviously had a lot of contacts in the entertainment world, and he called upon a lot of them to come and do this. Art Linkletter, who had hosted the opening of Disneyland, who was a friend of Walt's, Walt kind of contracted him to kind of help line up this talent, and brought in all sorts of people, people you'd think of the era, people like Bing Crosby. Marlene Dietrich was there. She was a big hit with the German hockey team. And they brought in Jane Mansfield as the media host, which I guess was a savvy move on their part. And all sorts of people. They had Danny Kaye come in to, he would entertain for the athletes, and they would do this every night. They had a dining hall. They would clear out the tables. They would set up chairs, and they always had, and I've seen some like memos about this, they were way over like the fire marshal's limit for the place, and they would always like try and like shut it down. But then I think there was one time where they were there were so many people there to see Danny Kaye, and the fire marshal or somebody on his behalf tried to shut it down, and he just sort of made fun of the guy and made it part of the act. And it was a kind of a whole thing. One night Walt brought the entire Golden Horseshoe from Disneyland, like all of those guys, and brought them up there and had just this really raucous show, and the Western brawl and all this stuff, and kind of freaked out the security people because they thought things were getting out of hand. But yeah, every night it was like Disney style entertainment for these people.
Yeah, and I don't think that's something that, the casual viewer of we're going to watch the Olympics here in, a week and a half.
Yep.
I don't think a lot of people realize that that goes on behind the scenes.
Yeah.
And I don't think a lot of people realize that what we see as far as the opening ceremonies and closing ceremonies and medal presentations and everything, that really came or was influenced pretty heavily by those 1960 Winter Games, which is really, really cool to think about. And they also, you mentioned in your book, they, and I want to be somewhat vague about it, so you tell it so I don't say another wrong thing. But there was a contest, and it was either a nightly drawing, or maybe something else, to where people could call home to different countries. What were the details of that?
Yeah, they had a raffle. I think it was all the medal winners
Yeah,
from that day were kind of put into a raffle or something. I think somebody, and then they would draw somebody's name or somehow pick one of them. And, the prize was you would get to call home wherever in the world that would be, which was a big deal at the time. And the stories, and in all like press stories, you never know what's like
yeah,
really really real, but there was one story that went around that one of the persons was so excited, uh they couldn't talk, and it was only when they got on the phone that they realized that like nobody in their like little village back home had a telephone,
yeah,
so they didn't have anybody to call. But yeah, it was something like, it was all like part of the show, and that was part of that nightly event where they would
yeah.
bring in and it would be part of it. So yeah, just a way to keep like the people engaged.
Yeah, that's really, really cool. And I mean, one thing, that the company has been very good at for a very long time is keeping people engaged in whatever whether it's theater, whether it's movies, TV, theme parks. The From those 1960 games, then if we're moving forward, um, did what type of influence did hosting or helping with those 1960 games, was there any influence from that over the possibility of opening Mineral Springs ski resort? Did they use any of that to kind of train for that?
Yeah, it's funny. I was just having a conversation about this with a friend, that there's this weird continuum that people don't really talk about, because it's, you see like bits of the story, but you don't see the whole arc of the story. Starting in the 1930s, Walt was a skier back in the day,
Hmm.
and he helped fund the Sugar Bowl ski resort
Okay.
in California. They were a guy was trying to set it up, didn't have enough money. Walt paid into it, helped raise a little money for it. There's a mountain there called Mount Disney, after him. And so that led over sort of years to the Olympics, which, and at the Olympics, Walt met a guy named Willie Scheffler, who actually, I maybe there were a couple of like German guys. No, it was Willie Scheffler. That's right. Hannes Schroll was the guy at Sugar Bowl. But yeah, this Willie Scheffler guy who is a crazy story in and of itself. He was like a Nazi resistance fighter. Like he fought the Nazis back in Germany, then fled to America, and he was the skier. He was advising those Winter Olympics, but he met Walt. They became buddies, and then he became a key advisor as Walt sought out to create a Disney ski resort.
Hmm.
And for the rest of his life, he was trying to get this project at Mineral King up in the mountains of California, off the ground. And even after he passed away, the Disney company continued to try and make that happen. It never did. Eventually, they tried another venue at Independence Lake, also in California. That never happened either. But yeah, there is this whole arc of Walt always interested in like winter sports.
Hmm.
They opened this venue in Denver called the Celebrity Sports Center, which was a massive recreational venue. Didn't have skiing, but had a lot of other stuff. And so, yeah, this was an ongoing interest,
Yeah.
definitely.
Well, and even as far back as when he got into polo, and so the whole studio, seemingly many people from the studio got into playing polo and everything. The kind of interest in sport within for him and then within the company, and for anybody who any students or anybody who's watching or listening, yes, Mineral King did not end up being built. There is a portion of kind of Mineral King in Walt Disney World. That's where we got the Country Bear Jamboree, for anybody who was wondering about the origin of that show. And then also, you talked about when you were talking about his just interest in winter sports. It makes me think, I've never thought of why Blizzard Beach is themed the way that it is. And I wonder if that is some type of homage to the interest that he and others had within the company in the early days of winter sports, the Blizzard Beach water park, for those that don't know.
It's a good question. I don't know. I've never thought about that way. But I just think there's always been an interest at Disney about doing something with winter recreation, and his interest in it had like other effects. There was a Goofy short in the 1940s called The Art of Skiing,
Yeah.
and that has a lot of references to Sugar Bowl in it. There's the lodge in that cartoon looks like the lodge at Sugar Bowl, so it did spin off. And like his polo, they made a short Mickey's Polo game,
Yeah.
based on his obsession with polo in the 1930s. Yeah.
Yeah. And I think talking about movies and shorts, and kind of how they aligned with whatever interests he had in sports, winter sports, and others, I think is a good segue to talk about the Walt Disney Company has at various times owned stake in different professional leagues, or different professional teams, I should say. And then also during those relationships, or during those uh, ownerships, they were also producing movies using that sport as the focal point of those movies, which kind of goes back to, one of the reasons Disneyland was built was to kind of promote the movies that people could watch. So two of the teams that I have pulled out, and please let me know if I'm leaving any out, but at one time, the Walt Disney Company was part owner of the Anaheim Ducks. At that time, it was the Anaheim Mighty Ducks, and it did coincide with the Mighty Ducks movies. And actually, if I remember correctly, in the second Mighty Ducks movie, the kids on the team actually wear the first jersey that the NHL team wore. Is that
Yeah.
That's correct, right?
Yeah.
And tell us why that came about, because the story I've heard is very interesting and kind of almost coincidental as to like how that relationship came.
Yeah. So as I understand it, I mean, Michael Eisner, who was head of Disney at this time, uh, the biggest believer in synergy of anyone in history. And he was obsessed with hockey. He was a big hockey fan. He'd grown up watching hockey. Two of his kids played hockey. That's when he really got into it. Like I remember in the old when they would send out the annual report every year, and it would have a letter from him at the start, and it would be like, I'm on my way to my kid's hockey game or something like that. So he was really into hockey, and he had been at Paramount when they made Bad News Bears.
Mhm.
And so in the early 90s, he went to Jeffrey Katzenberg, who was head of the studio at the time, the Disney film studio, and said, how about you make Bad News Bears, but hockey? And they did. They made Mighty Ducks in 92. And then this kind of coincided with a sort of a weird series of events. Eisner I believe, had had an offer to get a hockey team, for Disney to get a hockey team, and had turned it down. And then kind of like had second thoughts about it. Meanwhile, Anaheim, the city of Anaheim, was really trying to get a pro team of some sort. And so they built an arena without having a team to put in it, which seems unwise. It turned out to be unwise because they couldn't get anything. And so Eisner was like, well, they have this arena, they have nothing to fill it. They're kind of desperate. Maybe this will be a good deal to make, you know. And so he went back to the NHL and did his thing. Later, he said that, you know, he did it as just like a good citizen thing for the city of Anaheim. It's not like a big business deal. It's just, you know, good citizenship. We're doing it for the city of Anaheim. So I don't know how true that is, but anyway, so they got a team. They named it the Mighty Ducks of Anaheim, which everybody made fun of in the press. He said, I pulled a quote. He said, if we're a very good team, I think it will be a great name. If we're a very bad team, it will be a bad name. So I don't know. He came out to like the announcement. He had a Mighty Ducks jersey and he had a hat that said Coach Goofy on it. So he was like really in the middle of this. He was really throwing himself into this. So it started. They were the Mighty Ducks of Anaheim. They played at the Arrowhead Pond arena. They after they bought the team, they made the second of 3 Mighty Ducks movies, which was filmed at the pond. A lot of it was filmed at the pond before the team started actually playing there. And, you know, they brought in, you know, Jack Lindquist, who had been his big Disneyland honcho, and he helped market the team. And, you know, they did everything like in excess. Before the first game at the pond, they had a 15-minute like pre-show that cost $500,000 to put on. So
Wow.
they went full bore, and they, you know, they announced that like Ducks paraphernalia, merchandise would be sold at, you know, every Disney store across the country. But the thing is, it worked. In like the first few years, Mighty Ducks like uniforms, jerseys, and stuff like that outsold all other NHL teams put together. So, you know, it worked. The synergy worked.
Yeah, and the like I really like that story. Just kind of how the way it was told to me is it was kind of a person's interest, and they had the means to do it because they were head of one of the largest entertainment companies, so they could, and so
Yeah.
they did. And a lot of it was based off of, you know, their interest of watching their kids play and everything. And, you know, Michael Eisner, after he left the company, now he is, I can't remember which team, but he's part owner of I believe a European football team.
Yeah, a Premier League team in England. I can't remember which one.
And
But,
so he definitely, you know, even post his Disney career has kept up his interest in professional sport.
well, and he owns Topps trading cards.
Yeah.
So he's still deep into it.
Yeah. I had forgotten about that.
I wasn't even planning on showing this. I have Mr. Eisner's signed Topps trading card.
That's cool.
It's probably the goofiest thing I own, but I love it.
So on the card, is it like affiliated because it's like, is it affiliated with the team, or is it just say like owner of Top? Like
it says it's the world's champions businessman. It's number 22 of what, I don't know. Michael Eisner, a giant of American entertainment. Does a rundown of his career. Eisner is now an investor and owner of the Topps company. So I guess they just made him a little card.
Yeah, that was the kind of precursor to what you can do now. Like you can send in your picture and you can pay for them to make you a card. That was kind of like a precursor of that.
So you just buy the company and they'll make you a card. Yeah.
The another team that can you talk about the history of the company with the Anaheim Angels, and which is kind of confusing because of how the team started, and can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah. So Gene Autry, who was an actor and sort of famous kind of cowboy Western guy, brought the California Angels, or I think originally they were the Los Angeles Angels. In 1960, they were an expansion team when MLB was expanding out west a lot. They were the second LA baseball team after the Dodgers went out there. And from the beginning, Walt Disney was on their board of directors. He was a member of their board of directors until he died in 1966. While he was alive, they started off in LA, they moved to Anaheim. And that was during Walt. Walt had a little influence in making that happen, and they became the California Angels. Fast forward, they always had an association with Disney, kind of, because they were down the street. They're really, really close. And in 1994, Disney did a remake of the movie Angels in the Outfield, which had been a movie from the 50s, not a Disney movie, which is kind of random. And the original movie, I think, was about Pittsburgh Pirates, but they made it about the California Angels instead, since that fit. And it did well. And so 2 years after that, Disney wound up buying the Angels too. They already had the Mighty Ducks, which played also close to where the Angels played, which was also close to Disneyland. This was also the period where Disney was really starting to think about building a second gate, a second gated theme park across from Disneyland. And the concept of the Anaheim Resort was really becoming a thing. So here we had this idea of putting together these parcels of land at Disneyland for the park, for maybe a third park, for expansion. Then across the way, having this huge plot of land where the baseball team played, and then across from that, the pond. So it all kind of tied together. Disney wound up buying the team, renamed it the Anaheim Angels. Walt Disney Imagineering came in because they had an old kind of rickety stadium where, incidentally, the Rams had played, the football Rams, which are now back in LA, had played. And yeah, so Imagineering came in, fixed up the stadium, made it real nice, and Disney had a baseball team.
Yeah, and for people who watch the Imagineering story, in one of the episodes of the Imagineering story, they do talk about like the Imagineers redesigning a lot of the Anaheim Stadium and adding if people haven't seen the outfield, behind the wall is this beautiful like rock formation and everything, and that was something that the Imagineers were responsible for doing. And one trivia point that I always like to tell people, I told the students this last week when I told them we were going to be talking about this, that Angels in the Outfield had a relatively unknown actor in it that turned out to be a very, very big name in Hollywood. This was one of his first kind of major Hollywood projects. Do you remember who that was?
I had seen when I was looking up stuff for this. I'll be honest, I've never seen that movie, but I was surprised at all the people that were in it. It said Matthew McConaughey was in it, among many others, but prime Matthew McConaughey.
Well, and I believe, I'll have to double check it, but I believe Matthew McConaughey is actually, he is the outfielder who gets picked up by, like, there's a scene where an Angel, Christopher Lloyd, comes in and picks up the outfielder to catch. I believe that is Matthew McConaughey.
That's hilarious.
And that was one of his, again, I have to double check, but I believe that was one of his first kind of major or marquee roles, because before that, like, he had been in like Dazed and Confused, but that was kind of a bit part that grew into something larger for him as the project went on. And another really cool thing that I think a lot of people don't know is when Major League Baseball, when a team hosts the All-Star game, they create these gifts for all teams around the league. And so when the Anaheim Angels hosted the All-Star game, it was during the time that Disney owned them. They created Mickey statues for all of the major league teams. And so some you go to major league
Yeah,
stadiums and you can see some of them out like on concourses and everything, and some of them are like behind the scenes. I'm a big Colorado Rockies fan. I one time took a tour of Coors Field, and that's one of the things that they point out. And they kind of tell the story behind, when the game or when the All-Star game was held in Anaheim. So it's just a really, really fun
that's
kind of
fun.
tidbit
Yeah.
on it. Um, so we've talked about the 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 interest in winter games, the collaboration with the 1960 games. We've talked about some of the professional leagues they've been associated with, the movies that they have created through those associations for cross promotion. But they also have at various times, and a lot of it has happened at Walt Disney World because I think the the space that they have. At various times, they have been affiliated with different professional leagues. Correct me if I'm wrong. They've had race car racing events at Disney World. They've also had PGA tournaments at Disney World, and I was wondering if you how much you know about kind of the background of those type of events and those type of relationships, because they didn't none of them lasted too long. But I wondered if you had ever dug up any research on any of that.
Yeah, well, I mean, the golf thing goes back like to the very, very start because the, I mean, first, the Disney executives who were in charge when Disney World was being designed and built were all big golfers. So golf was going to be a big part of the vacation kingdom. It was built into it. The resort that is now a non-Disney resort called Shades of Green, right near the Polynesian, was originally, it opened in 1973 as the golf resort. It was a golf hotel, Centuric Hotel. And so, they brought in, over the years, they expanded their offerings. They had, professional golfers design new courses, and they had these major PGA events there with, the big stars of the era were all down there, all the names, all the big names. So, I mean, that was a recurring thing all throughout sort of Disney history. It's kind of fallen off as I think probably it became a less profitable thing for them. I think over the years they maybe outsourced some of those courses to outside operators, perhaps. But again, in the 1990s, as you mentioned, they made the speedway there in the parking lot of the
Mhm.
Magic Kingdom. And originally I think they had some grand plans to have tons of major races there. And I mean, they did have races. I don't think it ever materialized like that. Eventually, they had the Richard Petty driving
Yeah.
experience there, where you could, pay and race like a stock car around the track. But I don't think it ever materialized as much as they wanted it to be like a big, like destination venue. But yeah, it's expanded in the, earlier you said they bought ABC. A lot of the reason for that was ESPN.
Mhm.
And so in the late 90s, they created the Wide World of Sports Complex, which is behind you right now, which has been rebranded the ESPN Wide World of Sports Complex. And, this again goes to Eisner. Eisner had been part of the creation of Monday Night Football when he was in his earlier career in TV. So he was really invested in sports, and so they made this a big destination for amateur teams, AAU teams, youth league teams. The Atlanta Braves, my team, were there. It was their spring training home for many, many years. They just ended that affiliation. And so the Wide World of Sports Complex has become a big, big venue for them over the years. And of course, now they have Run Disney, which is a massive thing in and of itself.
And you mentioned Iger and his time with ABC, and part of listening to his book, he talks about being affiliated with Wide World of Sports also, which was, people now probably don't know, but Wide World of Sports was a very major program on ABC.
It's a big, big, big deal. Yeah.
And so, it's no coincidence that, the complex is called Wide World of Sports, and is also, now the ESPN Wide World of Sports. And yes, before we were recording, we talked about a large reason, or a big reason, for purchasing ABC and capital cities in the early 80s was the ESPN distribution, being really the only major sports and entertainment programming network at that time. And it's also interesting that recently there have been rumors, what would Disney do with ESPN? Would they started ESPN Plus, and it launched before Disney Plus, and how successful is ESPN Plus? What's the future of ESPN with the company? And because, like, in this latest round of financial disclosures, when the company disclosed how much money they were spending on streaming or spending on entertainment, a massive portion of that was things like television rights for the NFL and NHL and NBA and things like that. That it is really, really interesting to think about how the company has been, or their relationship with sport, throughout their history. It's really, really interesting to think about that. And then you did mention Run Disney, which is a very successful program now for the company. Can you talk a little bit about kind of the beginnings, the history of Run Disney, and some of the things that they do, and the expansion of it, because now it happens it happens on Castaway Cay now. That
Yeah. Well, the first Walt Disney World, it wasn't always Run Disney. They just had, in 1994, they had a Walt Disney World Marathon, and that was it. And so then it became, all right, the Walt Disney World Marathon, and it was an event. And eventually that led to the creation of something called the Disney Endurance Series,
okay.
which evolved into Run Disney, which is what it is now. Now it is, I think it's like 20 something races every year. And I mean, they have all sorts of, every sort of length of race that you can think of, every combination of length of race you can think of. And they have them themed to different events that happen at the resort. They have them themed to different characters, different properties like Star Wars and Marvel and whatever. And now they have them around the world. They had them at Disneyland. They've had them in Paris, I believe. As you said, Castaway Cay. It's a huge industry now. They've had sponsorship deals. I know New Balance was a sponsor for a long time, and they sponsored the running trails at Walt Disney World as part of that. And would have like custom gear. And I mean, for a lot of people, I think it's more a social event than a race. I mean, a lot of people go are serious runners. A lot of people are not, and go because the routes go backstage at the theme parks, which is cool. They have like rare costume characters along the way where you can stop and get a selfie. I mean, no serious runner is stopping to take a selfie with the character, but everybody else is. And so it has just become a really massive industry. And I don't know if they ever expected that. I certainly didn't,
Yeah.
but it's quite a thing.
I have I've run several 5Ks. That's about the farthest distance that I can run. But I definitely have thought about, if I'm ever going to do a half marathon or a marathon, I would want to do it at Disney, because essentially the way I work it in my head is you could run from park to park, and then you could walk in the parks. When you got to a certain park, you
Yeah.
could just walk while you're there. And then when you're outside of the park, well, you just run to the next park. I know it's not that easy. I know it would be very, very difficult for me, but that's
Yeah, I won't
something
be
that's
doing that
really fun.
anytime soon. I always see I'm a night owl, so I'm always awake when like the people are out in the freezing weather at
Yeah.
like 4 in the morning getting ready to run 20 miles. I'm like, nope, no, thank you. No, thanks.
They so next, the next thing I want to talk about is the Wide World of Sports complex, which is, as people can see from my background, a very big recreational and some professional. As you said, the Atlanta Braves played there for a long time at the stadium over my left shoulder. Um, it's a massive sports complex that can host AAU tournaments, collegiate tournaments. It played a big role in completing seasons during the 2020 pandemic, which we'll talk about here in just a little bit. But can you talk about some of the things that go on at the Wide World of Sports complex?
So many things. I'm not really sure what their original motivation for this was. I have a feeling it probably was, well, first Eisner's love of sports, looking for ways to better utilize empty land at the resort. And there were always school, in off times down there. They wanted to bring in, back when there was such a thing as an off time, which there really isn't anymore. They wanted to bring in like school groups and things like that. Yeah, they would always have cheerleading competitions. I remember at the Studios Park, that were kind of
Mm-hmm.
terrifying. But as it grew, they built this venue, which I think was intended to draw youth, large groups of young athletes. And yeah, it's done everything from little league to pro sports, and they've expanded over the years and it's just gotten more and more elaborate. And it seems like there's always something going on down
Yeah.
there, really.
Yeah.
In non-COVID times, there's always something going on.
Well, and even like I mentioned AAU, the Amateur Athletic Union, and their headquarters, which I read recently, I think they're moving their headquarters.
Oh,
It's
really?
still, I think it's still on property, but they're going to be in a different building, maybe.
Oh, okay.
But the AAU headquarters for a long time was actually the welcoming center, like the original kind of welcome or planning center for Walt Disney World before it opened, correct? Like that's where people
Yeah,
could go and they could read about what was going to happen in like the
yeah.
late 60s and early 70s.
The
Um,
first like public facility on property, and it's still there. You would go in and see a model of Walt Disney World that would tell you what's coming. And but yeah, it has been for a long time the AAU headquarters. Just a weird historical connection.
yeah. And so on the Wide World of Sports, it does have some regular events there, regularly, kind of some of the, when in college football, when I believe it's the Citrus Bowl. I think that's still the name of the stadium in Orlando. I know it's the bowl game, but is that, what is the
It's
name
at
of the
Camping World Stadium
okay.
now, I believe.
Yeah.
Yeah.
In Camping World Stadium, that's where they hold, is it the Reese's Senior Bowl? They hold one of the post
Yeah.
season college games there, like where people go and they play for, to essentially have extra time for recruits or professional teams to watch them. So at ESPN Wide World of Sports, they'll hold kind of the collegiate challenges, which is they'll feature some of their collegiate quarterbacks and throwing challenges and running backs and receivers and linemen and everything. They also have done that for the Pro Bowl a few times, I thought, and maybe that's something that's more regular now since the Pro Bowl for the NFL isn't held in Hawaii. They have recently been doing more and more of that. But is there anything before we get to 2020 in that discussion? Is there anything else that you have come across that they regularly do at the ESPN Wide World of Sports complex with either professional or collegiate teams or leagues?
Nothing that I can think of. I mean, I know they even use it for like corporate clients who come. Like, if you want to have an event for your employees, kind of like a field day,
Hmm.
like a school field day, and or some sort of sports themed event, you can rent it out for that. So a whole range of clients from kids to just corporate people to actual athletes. Yeah.
Yeah. So then, one of the last things I want to talk about before we get to, I always want to do the rapid questions. One of the last things that I have on my list of topics is when we look at what happened in March 2020, everything shuts down. Leagues shut down. The NBA and NHL were in the middle of their leagues. They suspended play because of the COVID-19 pandemic and the onset. Major League Baseball they were in spring training, so they actually didn't start their season in 2020 until into July. Um, Major League Soccer had just started their season, so they suspended play. And as we moved through the pandemic, and I've been lucky enough to write a little bit about this, the leagues started to look at how they could finish their seasons. And two leagues in particular actually chose the ESPN Wide World of Sports complex. The National Basketball Association, they were at a point in their season where they were, I think all teams it was under 20 games left in the season. So 15 to 20 games. So they were at a point where they could kind of conclude the season at ESPN Wide World of Sports. And the plan that they had, it really turned into kind of this neat, like, discussion topic of the teams that qualified to be in what they termed the Walt Disney World bubble. And, it was like different teams were, depending on depending on teams' records, there were 3 different hotels on property
Yeah.
that teams stayed in because people weren't, guests, a lot of guests weren't staying, or I'm sorry, a lot of those hotels, they weren't open to guests. And so, can you talk a little bit about the NBA bubble from the end of the 2020 season at ESPN Wide World of Sports?
Yeah. Well, they brought in, like you said, it's towards the end of the season, so they kind of had an idea of who was in contention for a playoff berth. So they didn't bring all the teams. They brought all the teams that were within, I don't remember how many games of being able to be in the
Hmm.
playoffs, which was most of the teams, just not all. And so they brought them in, and like you said, my favorite thing was like seeding. Like
Yeah.
the ones with the best records got the Grand Floridian. Then the ones a little bit down got Yon Beach Club. Then the ones a little bit down got Coronado Springs. So they converted. This was good synergy because first the NBA was going to lose a ton of revenue
Hmm.
from not broadcasting games. Disney was losing a ton of revenue by not having people in the resort. So it's like perfect synergy. And they set up in conference rooms. They set up training facilities. It's so weird to see pictures of like ballrooms at the hotels with like practice courts and stuff like that. And they had like rules, crazy rules about who could go into the bubble, who could come out of the bubble, how you had to be tested regularly. At first, they didn't allow people's families in. Eventually, they did. But they brought in, all the facilities, like training facilities. They set up. I saw pictures of a pop-up barbershop that they had, ESPN branded barbershop they had
Mhm.
at Grand Floridian outside. And so just lots of weird stuff like that. And it really was a bubble. They lived off of Disney food and had Disney entertainment and, did recreational stuff like did fishing and golf and all the stuff that you can do at Disney World, but just all within their little bubble. So yeah, it was a weird experiment, but in the end, the NBA certainly seemed happy with it. At the end,
Mhm.
the players, some griped about it, some thought it was funny, um, but yeah, just kind of a weird experiment.
Yeah, and I remember you mentioned the families. I remember it was like because they each team went and they played 8 games to kind of close out the regular season, and then they had this seeding. That was actually the start of kind of the way the playoffs have worked for the last 2 years, where your first 1 through 6 actually make the playoffs, and then 7 through 10 play each other to see who's going to get those final 2 playoff spots. They kind of did that with the bubble. And then once they started the playoffs, I believe it was teams that made it to the second round of the playoffs. So essentially the conference semifinals, that's those teams could bring their families.
Yeah,
Because essentially at that point, you think about the teams that didn't make the cut for the playoff leaving, and then the teams that didn't make the first cut and then lost out in the first round. They were left with, I think, 8 teams at that point, so they could bring in more capacity. So they brought in families and everything, but it turned into this really neat, like just the way that it was covered and everything. Obviously, everything's covered on ESPN. All the games are on ESPN.
mhm.
The arenas. I remember watching and thinking how neat it was that the arenas, they couldn't have fans in them, so they had these huge virtual. They had these huge television boards, and if you were a fan of a team, you could kind of sign up and sort of enter this lottery to be attending the game via Zoom. And so you would see, like, they would have fans
Yeah.
on the boards and everything, and they would even do the team that was the home team for that game. They would like have cheers for that team, and it like the video boards would be decorated, and portions of the court would be decorated for like whatever team was playing, which I thought was just such it was such a neat thing to see. And I also remember that during that time, it was disclosed that Disney kind of wanted to use this for sort of a practice run to get inroads with the NBA. Um,
Mhm.
that maybe there would be something more regular that would happen on a maybe an annual basis or a semi-annual basis that could happen on Walt Disney World property. So it's just a really, really cool thing, a way to get in with the NBA and everything. Which on that note, since we're talking about the NBA, there is an NBA team in Orlando that actually does not have an affiliation with Walt Disney World. However, the name certainly seems to, link itself to the Orlando Magic and everything.
Oh yeah, pretty
Uh,
pretty clearly. And I remember when they started, there was a lot of like Sorcerer Mickey hats and
yeah,
pixie dust and kind of stuff. So the connection seemed pretty clear. Also,
and
they have the biggest Disney fan NBA player on their roster now.
yeah,
So
yeah. Are you talking to Robin Lopez?
yeah, Robin
Yeah,
Lopez.
because I
Yeah,
was going to mention when his because I think he was with the Brooklyn Nets at the time when they lost out of the wide world of the Walt Disney World bubble. He had tweeted like it was a joke, but he's basically like, "You can't make me leave. I'm just going to go like to the Magic
yeah,
Kingdom every day now." Like,
yeah.
um, so I mean, yeah, the company seemed to like it, the NBA seemed to like it. Some players, yeah, had some issues with it, and it I mean, would be a very taxing system. You know, it was very, very intense. I think it lasted 2.5 months maybe, that they essentially living somewhere in that tight of a bubble, and everything being tested regularly. There was something there. The one other thing I want to mention about the NBA bubble, and then we'll move on to the MLS. Um, a lot of people don't know that the NBA bubble, they were working with, and I'll get the school wrong, so I'm not going to say what university it was, but they were working with a university in, gathering data on testing procedures. I
Mm,
don't know if you ever heard about this, but
mm-mm.
um, all the players had to be tested. I think it was like 2 or 3 times a week. If anybody ever tested positive, then they had to, it was that 2 week quarantine. And in that period of time, they had to test like a certain number of times. And after they came out of quarantine, maybe they were tested every day for a series of days. And definitely there's arguments to be made of, you know, leagues like that testing and using up all of the tests that were available at that time.
Yeah.
There's definitely arguments to be made about that, which is, I think, one reason why the NFL is maybe going away from testing for the rest of the testing the way that they did for the rest of the playoffs. Um, but I thought that was really, really neat that the the NBA was actually working on how to, they were measuring these testing procedures.
Hmm.
And so it wasn't just a sports entertainment, like endeavor. It was actually like, it was helping public health and inform public health, which I thought was really, really neat. And really I wish would have received a lot more attention than it did, because I
Yeah,
think
I
that
had
was
not
something
heard
that's
about
really
that.
cool.
Yeah, that's very interesting. Yeah.
And they actually, you know, it was one of the first to be able to come out and say, essentially, hey, all of these procedures work, all of these, things that we're doing work, because this is the number of players that were positive before they came into the bubble and couldn't come, you know, like they couldn't come in until they were negative. And then at a certain point, I know they announced once or twice, or maybe even more, that there were no positive cases in the Walt Disney World bubble. There was no one having to quarantine or isolate. Um, and so I thought that was really neat to note of how they use that for public health reasons. Another league, the Major League Soccer, they had just started their season. And this one was a little more confusing to me when I read about it and actually saw it being played. But essentially, they, in July or maybe even early August, I can't remember exactly when, they held a tournament at Walt Disney World. And then they did end up holding an abbreviated, kind of rest of the season in their home cities. But they also, you know, played there, at the ESPN Wide World of Sports complex. And I didn't know if you had any information that we don't know about that one.
Nothing that, nothing really. Yeah, this one was kind of vague to me. I didn't really hear much about it at the time, which is weird because you heard about the bubble
Mhm.
everywhere. And this was, I mean, you can correct me if I'm wrong, but it wasn't some kind of like, it was almost like a even though it wasn't before their season would be, it was almost like a preseason
Mhm.
tournament. It was kind of like a, I guess it was just keep, if you're an athlete, you want to play because you want to stay in shape. You can't just go sit for 6, 9 months or whatever. So I have a feeling it was done probably with that in mind. But yeah, it definitely didn't get as much notice, I guess, as the NBA bubble did for sure.
Yeah, it was this really confusing. I remember watching and keeping up with, the Colorado Rapids,
Mm.
and like each team was playing 3 games, 3 matches, and Colorado ended up, I think they lost 2 matches and tied 1 match. So they were eliminated from the bubble. And I remember thinking like, oh, they're eliminated from the season. And then like 3 weeks later, they're actually playing regular season
Yeah.
games in color. So it was this
Yeah.
really like difficult thing to understand, not, I guess, not well explain to casual sports fans. But yeah, it was sort of this like, it was like a early season tournament and it did have real consequences, that the teams that advanced the farthest, like they received more points in the regular
Yeah,
season and things
yeah,
like that. But it definitely was much more confusing than the NBA bubble that they that which that's not Disney, that was the league that created that.
yeah.
Um, so anything else that you have come across before we get into our rapid questions? Anything else you've come across that deals with the company's relationships with sports at any time in its history?
Well, there's a couple of things. One was, a lot of the people that were involved in the pageantry of the 1960 games were also involved in LA's summer games in
Hmm.
1984. And the mascot for that, the Sam the Eagle, was designed by Disney artist Bob Moore. And
Hmm.
I remember, I was a little kid, but I remember that eagle being everywhere on stuff. So there's a thread there. Also, something I thought about while we were talking that I had not thought about, in the lead up to our conversation, was that while I was growing up, and a lot throughout the 90s, the big rumor that kept popping up was that Disney World was going to try and get the Olympics for Disney
Hmm.
World. I mean, I remember that coming up all the time as like a rumor, and Disney would just kind of hem and haw about it. So, with the wide world of sports there, who knows? I mean, who knows if that would ever happen ever? But it's something that had been discussed, at least in the
Hmm.
press, a lot over the years.
Well, and now that you mention it, I do remember reading several things during 2020 about because the Tokyo 2020 games were postponed a year, and then even leading up to in the summer of 2021 when um, the kind of sports ministries of different countries were still discussing if they were going to send athletes and everything, and would the games be held in Tokyo, or would they just kind of cancel the games? I do remember a few articles that discussed maybe Walt Disney World and ESPN Wide World Sports in the Central Florida region being a hub that could host the Olympics on a more short-term basis, because
Yeah,
it was equipped to do a lot of this stuff. And being that it was the summer games, they had a lot of the facilities that would be needed for those. So when you mention that, I do remember reading a few things about that. And then, yeah, hearing the rumors that maybe someday they would want to get the Olympics and everything. And so I really, really thank you for um, entertaining all of these topics.
sure. My
The
pleasure.
As you know, with when we do rapid questions at the end, and since the first time we talked about your fandom and parks and favorite foods and everything's in the parks. I tried to come up with specific questions for this topic. So I have three, and you could, as with the first time, you could give an answer for these. You don't have to give an answer at all. But the first rapid question I have is there something, a relationship that Disney has had with a sports league or franchise in the past that no longer exists, that you would like to see come back?
Hmm. I mean, I am a big baseball fan. I would love for them to still have an MLB team. I
Hmm.
think that'd be really cool. And if they had kept the Angels, they wouldn't have renamed themselves the Los Angeles Angels of Anaheim, which I think is secret. So, that was a fun thing. It would be nice to have an AL team to root for. So
Yeah.
that would be me. Yeah.
And on that topic, I just remember reading the reports that the Braves were moving to a different stadium. Essentially, they got a different minor league or spring training stadium built in Florida. Um, was there more, did in your area, because you are in Central Florida, was there any more detail provided on them moving and the reasons they were moving and other teams not moving into the wide world of sports? Because at that same time, the Houston Astros moved from Kissimmee to a different stadium in Florida. And so that stadium is now vacant during spring training.
Yeah. Uh, well, and now that you say that, that may be my answer to the first question, the thing that I wish was still a thing, because I thought it was always so cool to have the Braves have their spring training at the Wide World of Sports. I What I recall reading was that sort of the center of spring training activity in Florida had kind of shifted. It's I don't know where it really is now, maybe more on the West Coast. I don't know. I think they just wanted to be closer to where the other teams were.
Mm-hmm.
That is my recollection. Don't quote me on that. But as to why nobody else has moved in, I don't know. Whether there's just not a lot of activity of that type going on in this specific area. Or, I mean, it's a great facility. You'd think a team would want that association because you get a ton of PR from it. So I don't really know.
Well, and there's been, there's been PR in the past for teams associated with Disney. So I would definitely think like you have, if I'm a minor league team, or I'm sorry, if I'm a major league team that doesn't have a strong following, especially a strong following in that region, it made sense for the Atlanta Braves there. I'm not sure that, the Rays really need it because they already have a strong following there, although they could boost it. But I would want to have my team play there because you do get a lot of exposure from it. I mean, look at what has happened for the University of Oregon. Their affiliation with they still hold the note that they're the only college team to actually have a Disney mascot for their official like Donald Duck is the official mascot for the Oregon Ducks. Or I guess I should say the picture of Donald Duck. But I would think I would want a association there as well.
And I mean, I'm not really versed on all the facilities of minor league baseball down at, or of temporary baseball facilities in Florida, but I would imagine that the facility at Disney is way better than a lot of the other spring training facilities that are out there. So I don't know.
The next one is we talked about something that has happened that no longer there's relationships no longer there that you would like to see come back. Is there a new sport affiliation or relationship that you would like to see for the company?
That's a really good question. Oh man, what could it be? Some sort of ACC basketball something. Would an ACC basketball tournament down here I think would be great.
Yeah,
I'd be all for that. Some sort of maybe preseason ACC event. I don't know, but I love it.
Yeah. And then the last one for the rapid questions, of all of the stories you've researched, maybe some of the ones we've talked about today, I'm sure there are a lot more. Do you have a favorite sport story about the company?
There are a few. I mean, there are funny stories about, Walt, like I said before, Walt had sponsored the Sugar Bowl Resort, and he went up there a lot with his family. And, this was before the days when people were, well, before he was on TV, before anybody was on TV, but before he was on TV, before everybody knew what he looked like, and he could just be Walt Disney or just be a guy. And there was one night at the lodge there where the bartender, I don't know, something happened to the bartender, so Walt tended bar for people for a while, for an evening, and just had a good old time. So stuff like that. There are lots of weird little tidbits about the Olympics in 1960 for all the stuff that went on, all the people that were involved from the Disney studio who would go on to become legends. But one I just discovered recently, which I was not aware of, but the official organ player of the 1960 Winter Olympics was the guy who was the manager of the Wurlitzer Organ Store
Hmm.
on Main Street in Disneyland. He was the manager there and would play demos of Disney music on the Wurlitzer organ in Disneyland. And he went up to be the official organist of the Winter Olympic Games. So that's another weird bit of synergy.
Yeah, yeah, that's very, very cool. This is a very cool story. So, Michael, thank you for this. As always, it's just awesome to sit back and hear the stories that you tell, and try to, um, maybe try to add a little bit here and there, but definitely not, you can't keep up with what you're talking about. Um, it's awesome to have you join us again. Um, for people that haven't heard the first podcast or watched the first video, what's the best way for them to keep up with what you're doing?
Well, you find me at Twitter at Progress City USA. You can also check out progresscityusa.com. I'm mostly, active on Twitter. I post sort of what I'm up to, what's going on. But follow me in either one of those places. You can find links to the podcast I do is at podcast.progresscityusa.com. But there's a link on the main page, so that should mostly allow you to keep up with anything I'm doing.
Okay, well, perfect. And again, thank you so much, Michael. Have a great rest of your day.
Thank you. You too.
Bye.